certainly pay attention to those throughout the webinar. So certainly let us know if you have any questions. As I mentioned, we're going to go ahead and record this so that other people can benefit from this valuable information. So again, my name is Erica Staab-Absher, and I'm the director of Hope Center. And we are so happy that you've joined us today to learn more about tonic immobility. And so I'm going to turn it over to Britta, and she's going to tell us a little bit more about her project, a little bit more about all this topic in particular. And at the end, we're going to open it up for questions and for information sharing and just some ideas on how to use this information and how to get it out into the community and out into the public for people about tonic immobility and why it's such an important thing to be talking about, be sharing about, and have more information on. So, Britta, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great introduction. So, as Erica mentioned, my name is Britta. I am finishing out my senior year at St. Olaf College this week, actually. And I am majoring in biology and women's and gender studies. So through these two majors, I decided to develop a project that I've been working on all year, really. And, you know, the bulk of this project has been learning all about tonic immobility and figuring out how I can really teach more people about this and bring this information to more people around campus and in the general public. So I've been doing a lot of work presenting what I'm about to talk with you guys about today. I've done that on campus through St. Olaf's Wellness Center. I've been doing writing for the Hope Center's blog. I have a couple more things in the works particular to tonic immobility that I'll be finishing up this summer as well. So I'm so excited to be talking about this with you guys today because I've spent this whole year learning about this, and I'm glad you guys want to learn about it too. So that's kind of my project and how I got started with this stuff. So I wanted to outline what we're gonna cover today. If my clicker will work. There we go. Okay. So we'll start with just a brief background on what exactly tonic immobility is. Then we will talk about this cascade of defense mechanisms as a response to trauma. We'll then get more in depth on some of the characteristics and cues that are associated with tonic immobility. We'll follow that with learning about some of what's going on behind the scenes in the brain while this reaction is happening. And then we'll talk about what sort of research is going on in humans regarding tonic immobility. And then, of course, how this applies to your work as advocates. And then for the last section of this, we'll open it up to some discussion and obviously questions. If you guys have anything I can clarify for you, I would love to answer questions then. So also, I want to note that probably I'll say either tonic immobility or TI, just because that's a little bit shorter and less of a mouthful. So TI is the same thing as tonic immobility. Okay, let us get started. So to just briefly overview and get us oriented on like what the bare bones basics about tonic immobility is, this is a physiological reaction of the body that is involuntary. And this can happen in response to really high fear, high stress, traumatic situations. You know, the brain recognizes this traumatic situation and puts the body into a state where you can't move, you can't feel any pain, you can't yell, but you are still fully conscious while this reaction is happening. This is also referred to as trauma-induced paralysis or rape-induced paralysis. And sometimes it does get confused with some other reactions like learned helplessness or acquiescence. Learned helplessness would be like being repeatedly exposed to negative stimuli and being conditioned to not fight back against that. And acquiescence is essentially like submitting to that traumatic event because you can't really see another way out of it. Both of those are, of course, valid ways of getting through a traumatic event. They're just different from tonic immobility because they do involve a degree of conscious choice. So yeah, just to clarify that a little bit. So research on tonic immobility really initially began when scientists were trying to figure out how animals respond to predation, actually. So this led to the formulation of a cascade of defense mechanisms that an animal would go through if they were being preyed on. And this info is really important to us to go through this because humans also go through this defense cascade when we're responding to threats too. So the first step in this cascade is arousal, when an animal would sense a predator nearby. And the body becomes really alert and aroused and tense, so that that prey animal is ready for action if the predator like makes a move. But the prey animal, even though it's getting ready for action, it's still trying to stay very still to avoid detection by that predator. If that stage fails, then fight or flight can be activated. These are more well-known, obviously, and they're both, of course, attempts to escape that predator if the prey animal is suddenly being chased, if the predator does end up seeing. So if both of those fail and the prey animal ends up being captured, that's when tonic immobility can occur. And really, this is like an evolutionary mechanism that's in place to prepare the body for really intense pain or even death when you're thinking about this in terms of predator-prey interactions. So as an animal is like progressing through this defense cascade, the amount of fear and stress that animal is experiencing is rapidly increasing to really high levels by the time you get to that TI mechanism stage. So all of this research that was being done about TI in animals also led to a more expanded list of what characteristics are associated with this. So we'll go through those quickly. Muscular rigidity, we already talked about that a little bit. That's that motor inhibition, immobility, like the most key component of this reaction. You can have tremors or muscle spasms, suppressed vocal behavior, which we touched on that already as well. Analgesia is just the fancy way of saying you can't feel any pain. You can have lower heart rate, lower blood pressure, your breathing slows down, your body temperature can drop. You can also experience periods of really rapid eye closure. And again, you are fully conscious while this reaction is happening. So experts also discovered that there were two conditions needed to induce this reaction. And the first is really extreme fear, right? We just talked about that with the defense cascade. By the time you get to that tonic immobility mechanism, the amount of fear that you're experiencing is really, really high. So the second cue is either actual physical restraint or even just the perception of being trapped with no escape from the situation. That can also provide that restraint cue. So I wanna play a video of a shark being put into tonic immobility just to illustrate what this looks like. Okay, so I wonder if there's a way for me to mute this. There we go. Yeah, we can see obviously the shark is being restrained by the scientists, and we can intuit that it's probably under some pretty extreme duress right now. And you can see it goes into tonic immobility here. If you look at its jaw, you can see some tremors, like we touched on. And then for the duration of tonic immobility, it's pretty variable how long it lasts, depending on like the species of animal or just like the situation itself. It can be as short as a couple seconds, a couple minutes, or it can last for hours sometimes. So it'll snap out of it in a sec here. Yep, okay, and then it's back to normal. Okay, so I wanna, whoops, that's going way too far. Before we keep going, I wanna pause, I guess, and give people a chance to ask questions if there's anything I can clarify right now before we move on. and also for me to get my slides back to normal.
And I don't see anything in the chat at this point.
Okay, wonderful. We will keep moving. I want this to be full screen, and I don't know why it's not doing that. That's okay. Okay, so we've already talked a lot about, you know, what's happening to the body, what are the, you know, physical symptoms, characteristics that are happening with TI, but there's also a lot going on behind the scenes in the brain during this reaction and also during the entire defense cascade. So I want to go through this too. So we'll start with the prefrontal cortex. So this, compared to the other brain parts, this brain part evolved last and is involved in higher thinking. Oh my goodness. Technology, man, it is not my friend today. Okay, well, I'll keep talking a little bit while we figure this out. So, like I said, the prefrontal cortex is involved in higher thinking, and this part is what gets considered like the Homo sapiens brain. It's like very particular to humans. Fingers crossed. Okay, we'll let it look. So this controls, you know, executive functions like logic, reasoning, planning, making decisions, things of that nature. And this is what is active and running when we are in safe mode. And it limits the reactivity of your brain's alarm system. So the next part is the limbic system. This is evolutionarily older than the prefrontal cortex. And it's a brain structure that we share with more animals. So it's part of what's considered the mammalian brain. So this part is involved in regulating emotion, controlling arousal, detecting fearful stimuli, things of that nature. So this is what is like the first alarm during danger mode, which corresponds to the arousal phase of the defense cascade. So the detailed story of what happens in danger mode. First, a threat is detected by the amygdala, which is like a small subsection of the limbic system. The amygdala then activates the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus will then trigger the release of a bunch of hormones to get your body prepared to take action against that threat that's been detected. So that's when you would feel like an adrenaline rush in the presence of danger. Again, this is what corresponds with the arousal phase of the cascade. So one thing to note about the hypothalamus being activated is that rush of hormones. Those hormones actually inhibit the functioning of your prefrontal cortex. So it's really hard to like think logically and plan when you're in this high stress danger mode. So this is why people might not respond in what we consider the logically best way during a sexual assault. It's because the logic center of their brain is really being shut off. Okay, so finally we have the midbrain. This is like the top part of the brainstem, and this was the first part of the brain to evolve, so it is the oldest. This gets considered the reptilian brain. As a whole, the midbrain is involved in motor movement, reflexive responses to what we see, what we hear, how our body responds to pain, how we feel pain. It basically controls what your body does with the information and emotion from the limbic system. So the specific part of the midbrain that's involved in the defense cascade is called the periaqueductal gray, which I'll call the PAG. This really small part regulates pain inhibition, heart rate and blood pressure, muscle contractions, vocalizations, and the fight or flight response. So all of that should sound really familiar to the TI characteristics that we talked about a couple slides ago. So the PAG can actually turn on both fight or flight and tonic immobility. It just depends on if it's being flipped on or off. So the on switch is what leads to fight or flight, And with this, you have motor movement is on, heart rate and blood pressure is up. There's some pain inhibition so that an animal could like keep running and fighting even if it has an injury. And with the on switch, the hypothalamus is still activated. So those hormones are still being made to keep the body's energy up, to keep running, fighting, whatever it is. So then with certain cues, the off switch is flipped, and that's what leads to tonic immobility. So with that, we have motor movement is turned off. Heart rate and blood pressure is down. There's stronger pain inhibition through a different pathway than the fight or flight pathway. And again, you can't make any vocalizations with the tonic immobility pathway. So what cues flip that off switch with TI? So unlike the fight or flight pathway, the hypothalamus has to be off. So there are no more hormones being made to keep our energy up and our body tense for action. That has to be off. And then there has to be the extreme fear. We've already touched on that a few times. And then in addition to that, there also has to be sensory cues from the body that reach a critical threshold. So that can be, you know, a predator has a prey animal in its mouth, and the sensory cue of the predator's jaw on the prey animal can provide that sensory threshold. That can also be a perpetrator grabbing someone's arms or holding someone down during an assault. With humans, however, I did mention this a little bit earlier, that cue of being trapped doesn't necessarily have to be physical. Even just knowing that you're about to be assaulted and don't have an escape route or are in an unfamiliar environment and can't figure out a way out of that place and that traumatic event that's about to happen, even that can provide that restraint cue too. And this is thought to be because humans can assign more meaning and emotion to a situation than most animals typically can. And then another note with the defense cascade, it's often presented as arousal and then fight or flight and then tonic immobility, but you can actually go right from arousal to tonic immobility as well. Okay, I see a little chat. Let me check that. Okay. So moving on, after all of this animal research had been going on about, you know, what are the characteristics, what are the cues, what's going on in the brain, all of this had been happening with animal research. And finally, researchers in the 80s started to notice that there were a lot of parallels between characteristics of TI in animals and what was being reported in rape and sexual assault cases. As I mentioned, originally this was referred to as rape-induced paralysis. You know, people were reporting that they couldn't move, they couldn't yell, they couldn't feel anything, all of which we now know correlate really strongly to tonic immobility. Oops, I forgot to click forward my slides. Okay, there we go. So, you know, also when you consider the conditions that are necessary for tonic immobility as well, these are also really typically present in sexual assault and rape cases, right? There oftentimes is that extreme fear. It's oftentimes there's either actual physical restraint or feeling trapped in that situation. So finally, the conclusion was drawn that tonic immobility does happen in humans too. So since that realization in the 80s, you know, since the 80s, research on tonic immobility in humans has really expanded. I think it's important to note that with researching this in people, this is only done through retroactive surveys asking about someone's experience with TI. You know, with animals in a lab, you can induce the TI reaction in animals like we saw in the shark, right? But this would not be ethical at all to put a person through this reaction to study it. So it's only ever done through surveys after the fact. And it does also get researched with other types of trauma as well, like war or car accidents, natural disasters, urban violence, to name a few. There's obviously a whole bunch, but we're going to focus on results from sexual trauma specifically, because that's obviously most pertinent to you guys and also what I've been doing the bulk of my research on as well. So let's get into it. There have been a few major studies that have determined how frequently TI happens in cases with sexual assault. And I think there's like 5 or 6 major studies. So, you know, more research definitely needs to be done to like thoroughly establish this. Because right now there's a pretty big range, right? Between 37 to 70% of sexual assaults have a TI reaction. So the first kind of major study with determining this frequency of TI, that was in 1993. And that is what yielded that 37%, that low estimate. And a few years later, there have been other studies, right? And so in 2005, there's a study that showed with childhood sexual assault, the frequency is as high as 52%. And then the most recent study in 2017, that showed that there's a 70% frequency of significant tonic immobility with people who have been sexually assaulted. And within this 70% showing significant tonic immobility, there's also 48% that had extreme tonic immobility too. So, you know, as research has progressed through the decades, you know, and as it's become more refined, estimates are becoming higher and higher, which means, you know, this could really be even more common than the original research even thought, which is really significant. So I want to take a moment to highlight that 2017 article that came out because it's really been groundbreaking in the field. So it's titled Tonic Immobility During Sexual Assault, a Common Reaction Predicting PTSD and Severe Depression. So this was done at the Emergency Clinic for Raped Women in Stockholm. Women visited the clinic either immediately after an assault or at least within a month of being assaulted to seek help. And at a follow-up visit 2 weeks after their initial visit, they were asked to participate in the study. And if they agreed, they took those surveys at that follow-up visit. And then 6 months later, they had another follow-up to assess their psychological well-being and if there had been the development of PTSD or depression or any other symptoms. So, and again, what they found was that 7 out of 10 women that they surveyed had experienced really significant tonic immobility, and half of those women had extreme tonic immobility, which is way higher than previous estimates from previous research, like I said. So there's 2 aspects about this study and its design that make it really compelling, especially with such significant results, right? The first is that their sample size was way larger than previous studies. They had almost 300 people complete the surveys for them on the initial research. And that adds a lot of, not that previous studies don't have any credibility, but bigger sample sizes make it even more sound data. And then the second, the participants were surveyed much sooner to the actual assault happening. In previous work, you know, sometimes years would pass between someone going through an assault and participating in that research. So with doing it so soon after someone goes through a sexual assault, that helps eliminate the possibility of faulty recall and actually underreporting of tonic immobility that maybe was a problem with previous research. So it makes these results even more precise than earlier estimates, which again is really significant because the estimates are a lot higher. Yeah, so this article is really great. Okay, so the next point is from a study that was looking at how frequently tonic immobility occurred in different types of trauma, like the ones we mentioned, in comparison to sexual trauma. What they found was that tonic immobility was over 2 times more likely to happen during sexual trauma. And furthermore, across the different trauma groups, sexual assault survivors also had the lowest proportion of respondents with no tonic immobility symptoms. So what that really means is that tonic immobility is happening more often and more strongly with sexual trauma than with other trauma types. Survivors are also 2 times more likely to have had that TI reaction if they have a history of assault, if they have, and that can go for if they experience childhood sexual abuse or other sexual assault in adulthood. And they're also 2 times more likely to have a TI reaction if it's a more severe assault that includes, something like physical violence or penetration during the assault. And multiple studies have actually linked TI to the increased likelihood of developing PTSD as well. So actually 2 different studies showed that respondents who had the TI reaction, were over 2 times more likely to develop PTSD. One of those was that 2017 study we just discussed. And actually that 2017 study as well also showed that people who had the TI reaction were over 3 times more likely to develop severe depression. So, this is really implying that TI can play a major role in the development of PTSD and depression and other really negative psychological outcomes for survivors in the months after an assault. This reaction has also been associated with increased guilt and self-blame for the assault. And both of those factors have actually been implicated in poor survivor healing as well. And then finally, the TI reaction itself may be very traumatic to go through as well, possibly, due to the loss of control of your body that you're experiencing. And it is actually more likely that someone may re-experience tonic immobility in later stressful situations if they have already gone through it once. So what is the bottom line with tonic immobility in terms of sexual assault? Ultimately, it's a very, very common response during sexual assault, and it mediates a lot of really negative outcomes and amplifies the effects of these negative outcomes. So although it's a very common response to sexual assault, it's not really well known by the general public, which that in turn has some really negative consequences for survivors. Someone who experienced TI during an assault may have, really strong survivor shame, questioning why their body froze up, why didn't they react a different way. They may feel a deep sense of shame that was their reaction instead of something else, especially because, they can't control that. On top of that, they may face public stigma. People may question, why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you scream? Why didn't you do this? Those statements are based on the premise, 1, that someone's reaction to an assault is always a conscious choice, and 2, that there is a quote unquote right way to respond that the survivor failed to do. Obviously, both of these premises are completely false, but that can be incredibly damaging for a survivor to hear if they're already feeling deep shame about the reaction that their body had. And furthermore, in legal settings, police and juries may often look for signs of active resistance from the survivor as compelling evidence that the event in question was actually a sexual assault. Obviously, someone can't fight back or resist if their body is in this temporary state of paralysis, but that does not mean that they were not sexually assaulted. But this lack of knowledge from the general public about TI can have really negative legal outcomes for survivors as well. So there are really, there's real serious problems with this sort of lack of knowledge about tonic immobility. I want to share this paragraph from a Scientific American article titled "Sexual Assault May Trigger Involuntary Paralysis," just to sort of capture what experts say about the legal consequences of TI. So I'll just read this quickly. The implications for rape survivors in the legal system are immense, experts say. If courts demand these people prove they resisted, says Kozlowska, these courts are actually causing psychological harm to women and failing to recognize the body's innate response to serious attack. So, a lot of experts have indicated and expressed, that increasing public awareness can really help mitigate a lot of these problems, which, that's why I've kind of been doing what I've been doing this semester with trying to educate students on campus and figure out how I can get this information to more people. But, you know, considering the work that you all do as advocates, it's definitely most pertinent to focus on that survivor shame aspect. So we'll get into that a little bit more. And I wanted to start this section with the final paragraph from that Scientific American article that I just read through. So I'll read this quickly. Oh, and this also quotes the lead author from that really groundbreaking 2017 article as well. So kind of tying it all together. It is critical, says Karolinska Institute gynecologist Anna Moeller, the current study's lead author, for rape survivors themselves to understand that their ability to fight was out of their conscious control. Education could be instrumental in altering interpretations of their behavior after the fact, reducing their shame and guilt. It could provide them, the study authors say, with evidence that they did not choose the path their bodies ultimately went down. So it can be really critical for survivors to be able to, you know, put a name to what it is that they went through, and, you know, to know that it's actually a very, very common response, and that it's something that's out of their control, and it's not like their fault that they had this reaction. You know, it can also be really beneficial to kind of reframe this tonic immobility response as a beneficial mechanism instead of something that's deeply shameful. One of the phrases I included in the blog that I wrote for the Hope Center was, your brain and body did what was necessary to survive that trauma. Because, you know, when you think about it, you know, this is a deep evolutionary process that's in place to protect the body during really intense trauma and to try and minimize injury and pain. So, you know, reframing it as like, this is a good thing that your body was doing the right thing to protect you, that can be really helpful as well. Some survivors, you know, may want to know more detail about what kind of the science is about tonic immobility, what exactly it is, why does it happen. It may be helpful for them to know that, you know, it's more likely that they may re-experience it in subsequent stressful situations. So I put together kind of a little summary slide with some of the most important points that I thought might be helpful to share with a survivor who wants to know more. So feel free to like screenshot this or write it down somewhere. Yeah, so like I said, you know, it can be so healing for survivors to know what it exactly is that they went through, and to know that they're not alone in experiencing this. As advocates, you know, to be able to respond empathetically, to normalize and validate that reaction, their response, and to share a little information if a survivor wants it, that can really help lessen that shame that they may be feeling. So with that, I'll turn it over to Erica, because I think she has some discussion questions for us. Or, of course, if you have any questions, yeah, definitely ask. And thank you so much for listening. I'm so glad I got to talk to you guys about this.
Well, thank you very much. I agree.
Okay, let me check the chat.
Really
Oh,
nice.
okay. So Jocelyn asked a good question in the chat. Do you know whether law enforcement and prosecutors are being trained with this information? Oh, okay. Neil answered that as well. Yeah, that's actually, I've been doing some reading on efforts with that as well. There's a researcher at the Harvard Medical School named James Hopper who actually runs like 2-hour-long workshops about this topic, and it's more expansive even than what I've been able to talk about today too. So yeah, that is a good way for this information to get integrated as well, because I think that's really a really critical point.
So some of the around the neurobiology responses is the SMART team and looking at that, and that is also something that we use in our advocate training as well. So I encourage anybody who's on the call who has either SMART teams, who trains advocates, or, you know, share this information on your Facebook page. Again, one of the main points is just to get this out there, because when we can name it, you know, people have a different response when they know it's not just their own response. There's a name to it. There's studies associated with it. It becomes something else external, and that can be really powerful for people. Even in just having these conversations between when Britta and I had started this, and I've been sharing this with different people, and even people who've been, doing their own healing work for a really long time, when we went into depth on this whole idea, you could visibly see them be like, oh, okay, it wasn't just me. And so just even survivors who are far down the path of healing, just again, hearing this information, knowing it just brings so much peace and awareness that this was something external to your own self of how you survived. And so one of the things, I just wanted to link two different things. One is that we know for our SANE nurses that compassionate, competent response reduces PTSD by 50%. And so imagine that coupled with prosecution and law enforcement and advocacy, sharing some of this information, and again, reducing some of that shame, that stigma. All of these pieces will greatly reduce that incidence of depression, of PTSD, and of all those other things further down the line. So we know that if you're experiencing sexual assault and you don't have healing intervention, you don't have competent care immediately post after, or when you do report to somebody, we know that all the bad things that can come. So higher suicidality, higher domestic violence in their future relationships, higher incidence of things like drug and alcohol use and other things to help numb that pain. So again, if we can help name this, if we can help reduce that shame and stigma, it's going to be incredibly healing and powerful for our clients and for the people that we're working with. And again, anybody who knows me and who has talked to me for more than 5 minutes about any of this knows the power of the multidisciplinary team. We all have a piece to play in this. And so that's the other piece that is exciting about this is at every different point within the system, we have different people that we can be educating and different people that this would make a large amount of difference with. So most of you know I've been doing some expert witness testimony. And again, utilizing this information in the expert witness testimony has been helpful. Having prosecutors know more about it so that they can ask targeted questions around that really helps to educate the jury on why that person might not have done what they should have done, what they thought they should have done. So those are some of the applications of, ways that we've already used this information to help kind of shift some of the narratives. The other thing that I wanted to talk about too was they're looking at what's happening in Wuhan with the children after post-trauma, post all the pandemic stuff. And so one of the things that they're finding is that there's a really large trauma response that's happening. So prior to this, the children that they had looked at, there was about a 2 to 3% incidence of traumatic responses, and now those children are experiencing like 20-some%. So we know that that's probably going to happen to some degree here. What that's going to look like or how that's going to happen, we're not entirely sure, but this pandemic is really increasing anxiety, depression, some of these other things for the survivor community, in general, but we know that the people that we're working with are higher risk. And so again, knowing that this happens in the past to help normalize that behavior currently. So linking the fact that, if you've experienced this in the past and your body is feeling threatened, you're feeling like you're under siege, you're feeling like it's an untenable situation, this is where this happens. And this is brain science and talking about, and again, externalizing some of that so it's not everything is all about how I'm doing this poorly, how this is, something that I'm failing at again. So helping to mitigate some of that, so helping to link all of these things can be really, really powerful for people's healing. So with that, I want to ask anybody has any questions or information that they would like to share about how this has helped some of the work that they've been doing, because as I look at the list, there's a lot of different disciplines on here, and there's a lot of different people who might have some interesting things to share. So feel free to unmute yourselves, and if you'd like to, show us your shining face, certainly ask us any questions, or I will pay attention to the chat. And I guess the other question that I would have is any of this information new, or was there anything that was particularly striking to you, or things that you'll think, oh, I can take this back and use this in this way? If you could share any of those pieces, that would be really helpful. So from Jocelyn, I would love to hear if anyone has had experience using this information in court, and if so, what has been the response from the bench? And I do see we have a few prosecutors here, so I'll let them answer. And then I do have some experience with that as an expert witness that I'll share in just a minute. All right, well, I'll go ahead and share then. So I have used this information in several of my, when I've been testifying, and so far there's been nothing from the bench, but there has been a lot of head nods and oh, and you can see that the information is really kind of landing with the juries. And in two particular cases, I do know that was very helpful in terms of helping them understand why the survivor responded the way they responded. And so I have gotten feedback from the prosecutors that that was impactful for the jury to hear and for them to help understand. So I would say it's highly helpful in your cases to kind of talk about that response. What other questions do people have? Or how would you like to see us use this training, or where would this be helpful to share in the future? The other piece I just wanted to highlight is, as Britta mentioned, she did write a beautiful blog for us, and it's actually in 3 different parts. I'm going to be modifying that, or actually Britta's going to be modifying that to become an advocate guide. So that will be something that we can incorporate some of the more technical pieces that she shared here in the slideshow, and then also some of the just kind of educational pieces for the general public that she shared on the blog. And so we're going to pull that together and have that be kind of an advocate guide for people, but that will also be used for prosecution, law enforcement, and other team members as well. So it won't be just advocates, but that will be kind of who it's geared towards. And I know that as Hope Center, we can make the commitment that we'll continue to educate our clients, of course, but also the advocates that we're training, and making sure that any prosecution, any law enforcement who wants this information can certainly have it. We ask that if this was helpful to you, that you make sure to share it with other people in your community. And we, as I mentioned, we will be sharing the link to the recording. We'll be sharing, once we get the advocate guide done, we'll be sharing that as well. The links on our Facebook page are either on the Facebook page or on our website, are links to the blog, and we can send out those as well with all the information so everybody can have all that together. It'll be just a little bit while I do the technical piece of uploading the recording, so don't expect it. Probably expect it early next week. But any other questions or comments? Or Britta, did you have anything else that you wanted to make sure that everybody knew?
I had a quick question. This is Toinette. Let's see here if I can do so you can see me here. Yeah, so my question was, hi, would victims ever have to do a psych eval in a court hearing of a rape case or sexual assault?
I have not experienced that. But I mean, I come from the advocate side, so that would be more of a prosecution question. Any of the prosecutors want to hop on that?
I mean, I would think that it would be more for the perpetrator if the perpetrator was caught and maybe having that done, but I was just curious if anyone has ever had that. I mean, I would think that maybe if the victim did have a psych eval, that maybe it would be in their favor to have one, if they did have to have one, but I was wondering if the courts, if that's something that they require for victims to go through.
So the prosecutors that we have on now, one from Rice County said that she's never seen that. She's worked in several different counties as well throughout Minnesota. And then another prosecutor said that they would consider that irrelevant to the criminal case because that would be not relevant. So it would be the perpetrator versus, you know, the victim response and that. So about what the perpetrator did.
Okay.
Would probably not be appropriate for a criminal case. But thanks for your question.
Thank you.
Any other questions, or Britta, did you have?
I mean, I guess I don't have any like new information, I guess, to share, but, you know, my hope with all of this is that, you know, more people know about this and, you know, if you guys are able to implement this information in really useful ways, I would always love to hear about that. So how about this? I'll put my email in the chat. So if anyone wants to like contact me with, you know, how you're using this, I would just love that. So that's all I had.
Well, and I know, Britta, you put a lot of time and effort into this, and I greatly, greatly appreciate that. And I know for me, I've learned a lot of stuff, and I've learned, especially like kind of the more intricacies of how the brain works and all of that is really fascinating, and I think it will be really helpful for everybody. So thank you again, and certainly if Neil mentioned that this will be really helpful for his officers, so that would be
good. I'm excited.
And and I do know that I've had several people, advocates and other professionals as well, just let me know that they didn't know anything about this. So getting out that information is incredibly valuable. So, and particularly as we're getting more information and more studies, we now know, again, like you mentioned, how common this is, and that can really be a game changer looking down the road. So I'm excited. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and we look forward to learning more. If there's anything else that you want to learn more about, or that we should do some more webinars in the future on, please do send me an email. My email's in the chat, or you can certainly give me a call and let me know what we should be talking about in the future. So thanks so much, and we look forward to joining everyone again. Hopefully in person someday.
Thank you, everyone.